The Ghost View Hospital had existed for centuries, tied to mysterious stories that no one truly understood. Although it had once been the most advanced medical center in the region, over time, the hospital fell into obscurity, left behind by newer, more modern buildings. The long, dark hallways, abandoned patient rooms, and yellowed walls created a strange atmosphere, like a forgotten part of the past. Emily, a young nurse just starting her job at the hospital, had no idea that her life would change forever the day she stepped inside. On her first day, everything seemed normal. Familiar patients, a steady flow of work. However, as soon as she entered the old hallway, an oppressive feeling washed over her. Even though the hospital was still running as usual, something felt off. It was as if someone was watching her, though she couldn't explain it. The sensation grew stronger at night when Emily had to stay late. During those nights, the hospital didn't feel like a place for healing anymore. The sound of footsteps, whispers with no clear source, echoed through the stillness, preventing Emily from feeling at ease. Despite trying to convince herself it was just her imagination, strange occurrences continued to repeat. Emily started hearing strange stories from other nurses and doctors in the hospital. Some had seen shadowy figures passing by windows. Others had heard eerie laughter coming from empty rooms. These stories only fueled her fear, making her more anxious about her workplace. One night, while walking down a dimly lit, empty hallway, Emily suddenly noticed a patient room door opening on its own. It wasn't the typical automatic door. It opened in an eerie way, as if someone were standing behind it. Emily cautiously approached, her heart racing. When she stepped inside, everything became unnervingly silent. The room was empty, but the air felt cold enough to make it seem like she had stepped into another world. The light overhead flickered and went completely dark. In the shadows, Emily sensed a presence, something standing close. When she turned around, a figure appeared in the corner of the room. It was a man wearing an old, worn-out patient gown. Emily couldn't see his face clearly, but his hollow, cold gaze fixed on her, sending waves of terror through her. In a panic, she rushed out of the room, her heart pounding as if it might burst from her chest. The next day, Emily couldn't shake the image of the man from her mind. She didn't dare tell anyone, fearing they might think her weak or imagining things. But the experience only deepened her unease about the hospital. Was it truly haunted, or was she just stressed from work? A few days later, another strange event occurred. Dr. Michael Lee, the head doctor, whom Emily greatly respected, invited her to his office. Dr. Lee was a rational man, someone who didn't believe in ghost stories. However, even he couldn't deny that something strange was happening at the hospital. You've probably heard some of the stories about this hospital, right? Dr. Lee asked when Emily walked into his office. Emily nodded, unsure of how to respond. I've heard a few things, Doctor. Dr. Lee said nothing more, instead quietly opening an old notebook on his desk. He showed Emily several records detailing unusual deaths at the hospital. Patients had died under inexplicable circumstances, many of whom had something in common. They were all involved in medical experiments the hospital had conducted in the past. These deaths, they might be the reason these souls haven't moved on, Dr. Lee said, his voice lowering. And they could be the cause of the strange phenomena you're experiencing. The information Dr. Lee revealed only increased Emily's confusion. She couldn't believe that the hospital had such a dark past, let alone that the ghosts of the patients who had died might be haunting the place. In the following nights, the strange occurrences increased. It wasn't just Emily anymore. Other staff members began to sense the presence of spirits in the hospital. Dr. Thomas, the surgeon, told Emily that one night, while preparing for surgery, he heard footsteps entering the operating room. But when he turned around, no one was there. Emily felt like everything was spiraling out of her control. Each night she worked late, she encountered more unexplainable things. Once, while checking on a patient in the emergency room, she saw a woman standing by the window. The woman didn't speak, only stared at her with hollow eyes. Then, suddenly, the ghost vanished, leaving Emily standing there, horrified and unsure of what to do. Each day, the hospital became more of a nightmare, and Emily didn't know how much longer she longtime staff members about the strange experiences they had had, but they would only stay silent, unwilling to speak clearly. The fear inside Emily grew, and she could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was a hallucination. The blurry images, the ghosts, and the whispers seemed to become an inseparable part of her life. Ghost View Hospital had turned into a place no one wanted to be in at night. Footsteps no one could see, shadows slipping through the dark, and the presence of lingering spirits waiting for something. Emily couldn't forget the strange experiences she had encountered, and despite her efforts to convince herself they were just figments of her imagination, the phenomena became harder to dismiss. One day, during a conversation with Dr. Lee, Emily noticed the noticeable tension in his eyes. Dr. Lee, who was always rational and practical, now seemed to acknowledge that something very strange was happening in the hospital. He no longer dismissed the events as mere stress or fatigue, but started to seriously consider what was going on. "We need to investigate the hospital's past," Dr. Lee said to Emily during a meeting after work. "I can't believe these phenomena are just hallucinations. There's something real and dangerous happening here." Emily nodded in agreement. She felt afraid, but also knew they had come too close to the truth to back out now. They decided to continue investigating. Dr. Lee began looking through old hospital records. After several days of research, he uncovered a horrifying discovery. In the 1980s, Ghost View Hospital had conducted a series of unauthorized medical experiments aimed at testing unproven treatment methods. Many patients had been neglected during these experiments and died under mysterious circumstances. These deaths were never made public. Dr. Lee began tracking the patients who had passed away during these experiments. He found a list of those who had died, and one of them was a man named John, a patient who was recorded as unable to die even after a failed surgery. John had been left in a coma for an extended period, and when he awoke, he showed no signs of normal life. But the most bizarre thing was that John could not die, and his presence at the hospital became a huge mystery no one could explain. Emily started feeling a connection between the strange occurrences she had experienced and the deaths in the past. She couldn't understand why, but it felt like everything was leading her toward a truth from which she might never escape. While continuing their search, Dr. Lee discovered an old research room hidden behind dark hallways few people knew about. The door to this room had been locked for years, and no one dared to open it. Former staff members had said this was where the strange medical experiments took place. When Dr. Lee opened the door and stepped inside, a cold draft rushed out, as if the room had been abandoned for a long time. Inside, everything was in disarray. Dust-covered desks, old patient records stacked on top of each other, and ancient medical equipment scattered across the room. Dr. Lee sifted through the old documents and eventually found a journal belonging to the previous head doctor who had overseen the experiments. In the journal, Dr. Lee read a chilling note. "We've made significant progress in treating patients with terminal diseases. However, some patients have died under inexplicable circumstances. Could their souls still be here? And can we control life and death?" This note sent a shiver down Dr. Lee's spine. It felt like a warning that the hospital wasn't just haunted by strange deaths. It was cursed by unimaginable medical experiments. After learning these horrifying truths, Emily and Dr. Lee decided they had to do something to confront the restless spirits. They knew they couldn't continue living in fear and had to face things they couldn't fully understand. But how could they help the spirits move on? Could they find a way to free them? Dr. Lee decided to arrange an exorcism. He invited an experienced exorcist to the hospital to help deal with the problem. However, the ritual was not simple. Everything began to unfold strangely when the exorcism began. The lights in the hospital flickered, and a cold wind swept through, making everyone feel like they were being watched. John's ghost, the patient who couldn't die, appeared in the room, his empty eyes filled with hatred. Other spirits started to manifest, and no one could control them. Screams echoed from every corner of the hospital, and the exorcism quickly descended into chaos. Everyone lost their composure and ran out of the room. The situation situation became increasingly tense. The spirits kept haunting the hospital, and both Emily and Dr. Lee began to feel desperate. Despite their best efforts to banish the ghosts, their presence grew stronger. The hospital became a place where survival seemed impossible, and no one could escape. Some staff members fled, while others felt trapped in a never-ending nightmare. Dr. Lee decided to return to the old research room once more to find further clues. He discovered that the previous experiment had not only been about treating illnesses, but also about manipulating life and death. The trapped spirits might be the result of these experiments, souls stuck between life and death. With no other options left, Dr. Lee decided to confront the spirits directly and do whatever it took to help them move on. But as he prepared for the final exorcism, the hospital was engulfed by a violent wind, and once again, John's ghost appeared. This time, John wasn't just a spirit trying to move on. He had transformed into a terrifying creature. The situation at Ghostview Hospital grew more hopeless. Despite Emily and Dr. Lee's best efforts to deal with the spirits still haunting the hospital, their presence grew stronger and uncontrollable. The ghosts they had seen before were no longer just faint images. They had become dark entities with unimaginable power. Dr. Lee read through countless ancient texts, trying to find a way to help the trapped spirits move on. He realized that the spirits who couldn't move on were part of the hospital's experiments that not only involved curing diseases, but also manipulating life and death. This only added to the danger the spirits posed. They weren't just trying to escape, they had a darker purpose. Ghostview Hospital was no longer a place of healing, but a cursed place where anyone who entered could become a victim of its restless spirits. Each night the hospital became a nightmare that couldn't be escaped. Footsteps, eerie laughter, and sighs echoed down the halls. The ghosts drifted through the shadows, their hollow eyes emotionless, though sometimes their stares were filled with hatred. One night, as Emily was reviewing patient records, she heard footsteps behind her. When she turned around, no one was there. But when she turned away again, she saw a figure standing by the window, staring at her. It was a familiar image, John's ghost, the man who couldn't die in the hospital's experiments. "He will never be forgiven," John's ghost whispered, his cold, empty eyes fixed on her. Emily couldn't control her fear anymore. She felt that every spirit in this hospital wanted revenge. They didn't just want to move on. They wanted to take vengeance on those who caused their death. She couldn't stay still anymore. She decided to go to Dr. Lee, knowing that he was the only one who could help her confront everything. Dr. Lee couldn't hesitate any longer. He knew that time was running out. The spirits in the hospital had begun to act more aggressively, and each night more patients fell into comas, just like those who had died in the experiments. Dr. Lee realized that if they didn't stop this, the hospital would never be saved. With great determination, Dr. Lee and Emily decided to perform one final ritual, the most powerful one they could find. They invited a famous exorcist to the hospital. The exorcist had heard about the strange occurrences at Ghostview and believed that the spirits were trapped by a force beyond human understanding. The exorcism would take place in the dead of night, when the hospital was completely silent, and all the spirits would be awake, filled with rage. To prepare, Dr. Lee gathered all the information related to the mysterious deaths at the hospital. He hoped that with this knowledge they could uncover the mysteries and help the spirits move on. When night came, the exorcist began the ritual in the old research room where the experiments had once taken place. Dr. Lee and Emily stood outside, their hearts filled with worry. The cold wind blew, and as the ritual began, all the lights in the hospital went out, leaving only the faint glow of a candle in the darkness. The exorcist muttered ancient incantations, but as soon as he started, a violent storm tore through the hospital. The research room door slammed shut, and all the windows flew open. Ghosts appeared from every room, from within the walls, gathering in the darkness. The fury of the spirits erupted. They didn't just want to move on, they wanted revenge. Screams filled the hospital. Dr. Lee and Emily felt like they were being pulled into another world, one where life and death were no longer distinct. The spirits stood before them, their eyes empty, but their gaze was filled with anger. When the ritual finally ended, A silence enveloped the hospital. The ghosts vanished, and the air became eerily still. The exorcist stood there, exhausted but no longer worried. He turned to Dr. Lee and Emily, nodding slightly. Their souls have been freed. But the price of this is not one that everyone can bear, the exorcist said, his voice deep and sorrowful. Dr. Lee looked at Emily. They both felt an indescribable sense of loss. Although the spirits had been freed, Ghostview Hospital would never be the same again. They had paid a heavy price. Dr. Lee decided to close the hospital permanently, and Emily, despite wanting to stay, knew she had to leave to find peace again. Ghostview Hospital was no longer a place for healing. It had become a legend, a story of restless spirits, forbidden experiments, and the price paid when humans tamper with life and death.